A gruff trucker named Cal stopped for coffee one midnight and met Nora, a girl with no home and a secret too big to carry. Together, they'd face the law, the road, and a bridge that held their pasts. Get ready for a journey of heart and hope. The Nebraska night stretched endless and black, a canvas of stars smeared across the plains, broken only by the faint glow of a highway snaking through the emptiness. Cal Wheeler gripped the wheel of his 18-wheeler, the rumble of the engine a steady hum beneath his calloused hands. The clock on the dash blinked 11:47 p.m., another late run, hauling grain from Lincoln to a depot in Cheyenne. The road was his companion now, its yellow lines a lifeline he'd clung to for 5 years, ever since the crash that stole his daughter, Ellie. At 53, his face bore the weathering of a man who'd aged too fast, lines carved deep around his gray eyes, a scruff of silver threading his dark beard. Sleep was a stranger, chased away by memories that flickered like ghosts in the headlights. He rubbed his neck, stiff from hours of driving, and spotted a flicker of neon ahead, Dottie's Diner, a roadside relic squatting off Route 30. Its sign buzzed faintly, the O long burned out, casting a pink and blue haze over the gravel lot. Cal didn't need food, didn't want company, but the rig's fuel gauge hovered near empty, and his own tank, coffee black as tar, had run dry miles back. He eased the truck into the lot, tires crunching over stones, and killed the engine. The silence rushed in, heavy and uninvited, pressing against the ache in his chest. He grabbed his faded denim jacket from the passenger seat, Ellie's sketchbook tucked inside, a habit he couldn't shake, and stepped into the cold. The diner's bell jangled as he pushed through the door, the air inside thick with grease, and the faint twang of a jukebox playing Patsy Cline. A handful of late-night souls dotted the room, a trucker hunched over a burger, a waitress with dyed red hair wiping the counter, an old man nursing a coffee like it was whiskey. Cal slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and stared out at his rig, its silver bulk glinting under the diner's glow. He didn't look at the menu, just waited, hands clasped tight, the sketchbook a quiet lump against his ribs. Ellie had loved diners like this, her crayons scribbling bridges and rivers while he'd sip coffee and tease her about her masterpieces. Now it was just him and the road. The waitress, Dottie, her name tag read, ambled over, her smile tired but warm. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, pen poised over a notepad. "Coffee," Cal grunted, his voice rough from disuse. "And a grilled cheese if it's quick." She nodded and shuffled off, leaving him to the hum of the jukebox and the weight of his thoughts. He was halfway through unzipping his jacket when he noticed her, a girl, maybe 12, sitting alone in a booth across the room. She was small, wiry, her brown hair a tangled mess spilling over a patched backpack. Her hands fidgeted with a straw wrapper, twisting it into knots, and her eyes, too big, too shadowed, darted toward the door every few seconds. She didn't belong here, not at this hour, not alone. Cal shifted, unease prickling his skin. Kids didn't sit in diners at midnight unless something was wrong. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, years on the road sharpening his instincts. She wasn't eating, just sipping a water, the glass sweating onto the table. Her sneakers were muddy, laces frayed, and a hoodie dwarfed her frame, sleeves rolled up to her wrists. Runaway, maybe, or lost. He'd seen it before, kids hitching rides, chasing dreams, or fleeing nightmares. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let Dottie handle it, but another part, the part that still heard Ellie's laugh in quiet moments, wouldn't let him look away. Dottie returned, sliding a chipped mug and a plate across the table. "Here you go," she said, then followed his gaze. "That one? Been here an hour, just sittin'. Says she's waiting for someone, but I ain't buying it." She lowered her voice, leaning in. "Keeps asking about buses to Omaha, but she's got no money I can see. You think in trouble?" Cal took a sip of coffee, the heat scalding his throat. "Maybe," he muttered. "Keep an eye on her." Dottie nodded and moved off, but Cal's focus stayed locked. The girl, Nora, he'd learn later, though she hadn't said it yet, glanced his way, then quickly down, her fingers tightening on the wrapper. The neon hum of Dottie's Diner buzzed faintly against the Nebraska night, its glow pooling on the cracked linoleum where Cal Wheeler sat, nursing his second mug of coffee. The grilled cheese sat heavy in his stomach, a lump he barely tasted, and the jukebox had shifted to a slow Merle Haggard tune. its mournful notes curling around the diner like smoke. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a restless howl that matched the unease prickling Cal's skin. His rig waited in the lot, silver and silent under the stars, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girl in the booth across the room, small, scrappy, alone. She hadn't moved since he'd spoken to her, just sat there twisting that straw wrapper, her backpack a patched shield beside her. Cal leaned back, the vinyl creaking under his bulk, and rubbed a hand over his beard. He shouldn't care, shouldn't let her tug at him like this. He'd spent 5 years hardening himself against the world, letting the road swallow his grief for Ellie, keeping people at arm's length. But something about this kid, those shadowed eyes, the way her hands shook just enough to notice, cracked the wall he'd built. She reminded him of Ellie, not in looks, but in that quiet defiance, the kind that said she'd been through too much and wouldn't admit it. He shifted, pulling Ellie's sketchbook from his jacket and setting it on the table, his fingers brushing the worn cover. He didn't open it, just let it sit there, a tether to the past he couldn't shake. Dottie shuffled by, refilling his mug without asking, her red hair catching the light. "She's still at it," she muttered, nodding toward the girl. "Asked me about the next bus again, 3rd time tonight. Ain't got a dime, far as I can tell." Cal grunted, sipping the coffee, its bitterness grounding him. "No uncle showing up then?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Dottie snorted softly. "Not unless he's a ghost. She's stalling, and I don't like it. Sheriff's number's by the phone if you think—" She trailed off, leaving the suggestion hanging. Cal shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Let's see what she does." He watched her again, closer this time. She was all edges, sharp cheekbones under pale skin, a jaw set tight like she was biting back words. Her hoodie, too big and frayed, swallowed her frame, and her sneakers were caked with mud, as if she'd walked miles before landing here. She'd said she was fine, waiting for an uncle, but the lie hung thin. Her eyes flicked to the door too often, her shoulders hunched like she expected trouble. Cal's gut twisted. Runaway, he'd bet money on it. He'd seen kids like her at truck stops, lost souls hitching rides, chasing something better, or running from something worse. But this one didn't have the swagger of a seasoned drifter. She looked scared, and that scared him too. The jukebox clicked off, leaving a hush that felt too loud. Cal drained his mug and stood, slow and deliberate, his boots scuffing the floor. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't have a plan, but sitting there watching her unravel wasn't an option. He crossed the diner, the sketchbook tucked back in his jacket, and slid into the booth across from her. She stiffened, her hands dropping the wrapper to grip the edge of the table, her eyes snapping up to meet his. Up close, they were hazel, flecked with gold, but shadowed with a weariness no kid should carry. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice gruff but softer than before. She didn't answer, just stared, her breath catching like a trapped bird's. Cal settled in anyway, resting his forearms on the table, keeping his hands loose and open. "Look," he said, "I ain't here to hassle you. But it's midnight, and you're alone. That don't sit right with me." Her lips parted, then closed, her fingers tightening on the table. "I told you, I'm fine," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper, rough like she hadn't used it much. "My uncle's comin'." Cal tilted his head, studying her. "Yeah, he's taken his sweet time then. Roads are clear. Ought to be here by now." Her gaze dropped, a flush creeping up her neck, and Cal saw it. The crack in her story, the tremble in her hands she couldn't hide. He leaned back, giving her space. "All right," he said. "I'll buy that for now, but you're shaking like a leaf, and that water ain't gonna fill you up. How about some food?" She shook her head quick, too quick. "I'm not hungry," she muttered, pulling her backpack closer. Cal raised a brow but didn't push, just flagged Dottie over. "Burger and fries," he said when she arrived, "for her. Put it on my tab." Dottie nodded, casting a curious glance between them, and headed to the kitchen. The girl, Nora, though Cal didn't know it yet, glared at him, defiance flaring in her eyes. "I don't need your charity," she snapped, her voice louder now, edged with something raw. Cal met her stare, unflinching. "Ain't charity?" he said. "It's a burger. Eat it or don't. I'm not going to wrestle you for it." She glared a moment longer, then slumped back, the fight draining out of her. Her hands stayed clenched, but she didn't argue when Dottie slid the plate across the table minutes later, the sizzle of fries filling the air. Cal watched her pick at the food, slow at first, then faster, hunger winning over pride. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch, the jukebox kicking back on with a Johnny Cash ballad. "You got a name?" he asked finally, keeping it casual. She froze, a fry halfway to her mouth, then lowered it. "Doesn't matter," she said, her tone flat. Cal nodded like it was no big deal. "Fair enough, I'm Cal. That's my rig out there. Been driving it longer than you've been alive, probably." He jerked his thumb toward the window, the truck's bulk a dark shape in the lot. She didn't smile, didn't soften, but her eyes flicked to the window, then back to him. A spark of curiosity, maybe, or just exhaustion. "You don't gotta tell me nothin'," Cal added, his voice steady. "But if that uncle of yours don't show, I'm here till mornin'. Roads are my home, know 'em better than most." He didn't say he'd help, didn't promise anything, just let the offer hang, quiet and solid. She didn't respond, just took another bite, her hands still trembling, but less now. Outside, the wind howled louder, a storm brewing in the distance, and Cal felt it, a shift, small but real. He didn't know her story, didn't know why she was here, but something about her, those eyes, that silence, echoed the hole Ellie had left. He wasn't her savior, wasn't looking to be. But as the night stretched on, he stayed. The girl with no name eating across from him. Two lost souls sharing a booth in the flicker of neon light. The storm hit Dottie's diner like a freight train, the Nebraska sky splitting open with a roar of thunder that rattled the windows and drowned out the jukebox's faint twang. Rain lashed the glass in sheets, turning the gravel lot into a shimmering blur, trapping Cal Wheeler and the girl, with no name, inside the neon-lit refuge. The clock above the counter ticked past 1 a.m., its hands sluggish against the night's weight. Cal sat across from her in the booth, his third coffee cooling untouched, the steam curling up like a ghost between them. She'd finished the burger and fries he'd ordered, hunger overriding her earlier defiance. But now she sat silent, her hands buried in her hoodie sleeves, her hazel eyes fixed on the storm outside. Dottie had dimmed the diner's lights, leaving the glow of the neon sign to paint the room in soft pinks and blues. The other late-night stragglers had cleared out, the trucker to his rig, the old man to wherever old men went, leaving just Cal, the girl, and Dottie wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. The air hummed with the storm's pulse, a restless energy that mirrored the tension in the booth. Cal leaned back, his denim jacket creaking. Ellie's sketchbook, a quiet bulge against his chest. He'd offered the girl a lifeline, his presence, a ride if she needed it. But she hadn't taken it, hadn't given him a name or a reason. Just sat there, a fortress of silence, her trembling hands the only crack in her walls. "You sure that uncle's comin'?" Cal asked, his voice low, cutting through the rain's drumbeat. He kept it casual, but his gray eyes studied her, sharp from years on the road. She flinched, her shoulders hunching tighter, and shook her head, a small, reluctant motion. "He's delayed," she muttered, her raspy whisper nearly lost in the storm. Cal raised a brow, sipping his coffee to mask the skepticism. "Delayed, huh? Roads are a mess out there. Might be a while?" She didn't respond, just stared at the window, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve until the fabric frayed. The lie hung thin, fraying like her hoodie, and Cal felt the pull again, that ache he'd buried since Ellie's death, stirring at the sight of this kid alone in a world too big for her. He didn't press, just waited, letting the storm fill the silence. Dottie shuffled over, her red hair limp from the humidity, and set a plate of pie between them. Apple, still warm, a peace offering. "On the house," she said, her tired smile flickering. "Looks like you're stuck till this blows over. Might as well eat." Cal nodded a thanks, sliding the plate closer to the girl. She hesitated, then took a small bite, the fork trembling in her hand. Hours crawled by, the storm unrelenting. Dottie dozed behind the counter, her head propped on her arm, the diner a cocoon against the chaos outside. Cal stayed awake, his back stiff against the vinyl, watching the girl drift into an uneasy sleep, her head lolling against the booth, her backpack clutched tight like a shield. He should have left, should have fueled up and rolled on. But the rain and something deeper kept him rooted. Dawn crept in, gray and sodden, the storm easing to a drizzle that pattered against the roof. The girl stirred, blinking awake, her eyes darting to Cal with a flash of panic before recognition settled in. "Morning," he grunted, stretching his neck with a wince. She nodded, rubbing her face, then grabbed her backpack and slid out of the booth without a word. "Where you going?" Cal asked, his tone sharper than he meant. She froze halfway to the door, then muttered, "Bathroom," and slipped away. Cal watched her go, unease gnawing at him. She'd been too quick, too quiet. He waited a beat, then stood, his boots scuffing the floor as he headed outside to check his rig, and to see if she'd bolt. The air was cool and damp, the lot a mess of puddles reflecting the diner's neon. His rig sat untouched, rain-streaked but steady, but the girl was nowhere in sight. Cal's gut twisted. He scanned the highway, empty, then spotted a flicker of movement down the road, near an old truss bridge half hidden by mist. It was her, a small figure trudging toward the rusted skeleton, her backpack slung over one shoulder. He cursed under his breath and jogged after her, the wet gravel crunching beneath his boots. She didn't hear him coming, not until he was close, his voice cutting through the drizzle. "Hey, kid, where you think you're going?" She spun, her face pale, her eyes wide with caught fear. The bridge loomed behind her, crumbling iron and warped planks, a relic from another time, swaying faintly in the wind. "Nowhere!" she snapped, stepping back, her sneakers sinking into the mud. Cal stopped a few feet away, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Don't look like nowhere," he said, nodding at the bridge. "That thing's half dead, ain't safe." She glared, defiance flaring, but her hands shook harder now, betraying her. The silence stretched, rain dripping from his cap, until she broke. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice cracking, raw and desperate. "Foster care, they don't care, just shove you around till you're gone." Cal's chest tightened, the pieces clicking into place. Runaway, orphan, lost. "Back where?" he asked, softer now. She looked away, her jaw trembling, then whispered, "Omaha. Fire took my folks last year. House went up, and I got out. They didn't." Her words hung heavy, a confession torn loose by the storm's aftermath. Cal stood there, rain soaking his jacket, the weight of her story sinking in. He saw Ellie in his mind, her laugh, her sketches, then this girl, Nora, alone with her own ghosts. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with something he hadn't felt in years, compassion. "That's a hell of a load for a kid." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, angry at the tears, and turned toward the bridge. "I come here sometimes," she said, quieter now. "They used to bring me, Mom and Dad. It's all I got left." He stepped closer, careful, his boots squelching in the mud. "Ain't much of a place to stay," he said, glancing at the bridge's rusted frame. "Storm's done. You don't have to run yet." She didn't answer, just stared at the water below, her shoulders slumping. Cal took a breath, the decision settling before he could stop it. "Look, I'm heading west. You need a ride? I got room. No strings, just a lift." Her head snapped up, suspicion narrowing her eyes, but he held her gaze, steady and sure. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, and she nodded, small, reluctant, a crack in her armor. "Okay," she rasped, clutching her backpack tighter. Cal turned back toward the diner, motioning her to follow, his heart thudding with something like purpose. She trailed behind, a shadow in the mist, her secret laid bare on the edge of that crumbling bridge, a first step across a divide neither had expected. Inside the diner, the air was warm and stale, the jukebox silent for once. Dottie glanced up from the counter, her red hair limp from the night's humidity, and raised a brow as Cal and Nora slid into their booth. "You two look like you've been through the ringer," she said, setting a fresh pot of coffee between them. "Storm kept you, I take it?" Cal nodded, pouring a mug, his hand steadier than he felt. "Yeah," he grunted. "Ain't going nowhere till it clears." Nora stayed quiet, her hazel eyes fixed on the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a sugar packet. Cal sipped his coffee, the heat grounding him, and studied her across the booth. She was small, wiry, her face pale under the smudge of dirt on her jaw, but there was a toughness there, a survivor's edge he recognized. He'd offered her a ride west, no strings, and she'd taken it, a reluctant crack in her armor. But the bridge she'd stood by, that rusted swaying relic, lingered in his mind. "You said your folks brought you there," he said, his voice low, careful. The bridge. Why'd you go back? She flinched, her hands stilling, then met his gaze with a flicker of defiance. It's mine, she rasped. Only place I've got, that's still them. He nodded, letting her words settle, the weight of them tugging at something deep. I get that, he said, his tone rough but soft. Got places like that myself. He reached into his jacket, pulling out Ellie's sketchbook, a worn, leather-bound thing, its edges frayed from years of handling. He set it on the table, his fingers lingering on the cover. My girl, Ellie, she loved bridges, used to draw 'em all the time. Said they were magic, holding things together. His voice caught, a crack he didn't hide, and he flipped the book open to a page, a pencil sketch of a truss bridge, not unlike the one outside, its lines wobbly but sure, signed Ellie, age 9. Nora leaned forward, her eyes widening, the sugar packet forgotten. She drew that? She asked, her whisper shaky but curious. Cal nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, got a whole book of 'em, bridges, rivers, whatever she saw. Kept it with me after she was gone. He paused, the memory sharp. Rain-slick roads, a drunk driver. Ellie's laugh silenced forever. Car wreck took her 5 years back, 10 years old. I was on a run, didn't even get to say goodbye. His throat tightened, but he pushed through, meeting Nora's gaze. That bridge out there, it's yours. This book's mine. Same kind of thing. Her lips parted, then closed, a tremble running through her. She reached out, hesitant, and touched the sketch, her fingers brushing the faded pencil lines. My dad built stuff, she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the diner's heater. Bridges, barns, work construction. Mom'd pack a picnic and we'd sit under that one, just us. Last time was before the fire. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, refusing the tears. I'd sit there after, when the Fosters got bad. Felt like they were still with me. Cal's chest ached, a mirror of his own pain staring back at him. He slid the sketchbook closer, an offering. Draw something, he said, pulling a stubby pencil from his pocket and setting it beside it. If you want. Ellie'd like that, someone using it. Nora stared at the pencil, then at him, suspicion warring with something softer. She took it, slow and deliberate, and flipped to a blank page. Her hand shook as she sketched, a rough outline of the bridge, its rusted beams jagged against the paper, a river swirling below. It wasn't perfect, wasn't practiced, but it was hers, a piece of her past spilling out. They sat there, the diner a quiet cocoon, as she drew and Cal watched, the coffee cooling between them. The storm had stranded them, but this moment felt like something else, a bridge of their own forming in the silence. Looks good, he said when she finished, nodding at the sketch. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased, a weight lifting just a fraction. Thanks, she muttered, sliding the book back. Cal tucked it away, the new drawing nestled among Ellie's, a thread tying their losses together. Dottie approached, her apron stained with grease, and leaned against the booth. Roads are clearin', she said. You headin' out, Cal? He glanced at Nora, then nodded. Yeah, got a passenger this time. Dottie's eyes flicked to the girl, a question unspoken, but she just shrugged. Safe travels then. Watch yourself. She's a quiet one. Nora bristled, but Cal caught her eye, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Quiet's fine by me, he said, standing and grabbing his jacket. Let's roll, kid. They stepped into the lot, the air crisp and damp, the rig gleaming wet under the rising sun. Cal opened the passenger door, gesturing for Nora to climb in. She hesitated, her backpack clutched tight, then hauled herself up, settling into the worn seat. He circled to the driver's side, the sketchbook a warm weight against his chest, and started the engine. As they pulled onto the highway, the old truss bridge loomed in the rearview mirror, a rusted sentinel, a shared anchor. Where we going? Nora asked, her voice small but steady. West, Cal said, his eyes on the road. Got a haul to Cheyenne. After that, we'll see. She didn't push, just nodded, her gaze drifting to the plains stretching endless ahead. The rig rumbled on, carrying them away from the bridge, but not its memory. A fragile connection forged in sketches and silences. Cal didn't know where this road would lead, not yet. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel so empty. Two broken souls, tethered by loss, had found something worth holding on to, even if it was just a ride for now. The Nebraska highway stretched wide and relentless under a midday's sun, its asphalt shimmering with heat as Cal Wheeler's rig rumbled west toward Cheyenne. The cab smelled of diesel and old leather, the hum of the engine a steady pulse beneath the crackle of country radio, Waylon Jennings crooning about lost highways and lonesome nights. Cal gripped the wheel, his gray eyes scanning the plains, the endless sweep of golden grass broken only by the occasional silo or windmill. Beside him, Nora slumped in the passenger seat, her patched backpack wedged between her knees, her hoodie hood pulled low over her tangled brown hair. She hadn't said much since they'd left Dottie's diner, just stared out the window, her sketch of the truss bridge now tucked into Ellie's sketchbook on the dash. Cal stole a glance at her, the quiet settling between them like dust on a back road. She was small against the seat's worn upholstery, her sneakers tapping a faint rhythm on the floor mat. But there was a steadiness to her now, a shift from the jittery kid he'd found in the diner. The bridge had cracked something open, her confession about her parents and his, about Ellie weaving a thread neither had named yet. He'd offered her a ride west, no strings, and she'd taken it, climbing into his rig like it was a lifeline. Cheyenne was still hours away, and Cal didn't know what came after, just that the road felt less empty with her beside him. "Ever been this way?" he asked, breaking the silence, his voice rough but easy. Nora shrugged, her eyes still on the horizon. "Not really," she rasped, her whisper gaining strength from the miles. "Foster's kept me in Omaha. Didn't go far." Cal nodded, adjusting his cap with one hand. "Ain't much out here till Wyoming, flat as a pancake till the Rockies hit. Ellie used to call it the Big Nowhere." He smiled faintly, the memory sharp, her small voice chattering from this same seat years ago, her crayon scribbling bridges across his log sheets. Nora's head tilted, a flicker of curiosity in her hazel eyes. "She rode with you?" she asked, softer now. Cal's grip tightened on the wheel, then eased. "Summers, yeah. Her mom, my ex, didn't mind. Loved the road, that kid, always drawing something, bridges mostly, said they held stories." He paused, the ache of her absence pinching his chest, but he pressed on. "You're good at it too. That sketch you did. Got her touch." Nora's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but she reached for the sketchbook, flipping it open to her drawing. "Didn't think anyone'd see it," she muttered, tracing the bridge's rusted lines with a chipped fingernail. "Glad I did," Cal said, his tone steady. "Means something? Keeping that bridge alive." She didn't answer, just kept her eyes on the page, but the tapping of her foot slowed, a quiet settling in. The radio faded to static as they crossed into a dead zone, and Cal flipped it off, letting the engine's drone fill the cab. They rolled on, the plains giving way to gentle rises, the horizon teasing the faint blue of distant mountains. Nora's silence wasn't heavy now. It was companionable, a space they shared without needing to fill it. By late afternoon, the fuel gauge dipped low, and Cal pulled into a truck stop, a dusty sprawl of pumps and a diner called Red's Rest. Its sign faded to a peeling pink. "Pit stop," he said, cutting the engine. "Grab some grub if you want, my treat." Nora nodded, sliding out after him, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The air was dry and warm, carrying the tang of gasoline and fried onions from the diner. Cal fueled the rig while Nora wandered toward the building, her steps slow but sure. He watched her go, a flicker of something, pride maybe, warming his gut. She wasn't running, not this time. Inside, they settled at a scratch-for-mica table, the clatter of plates and trucker chatter buzzing around them. Cal ordered coffee and a burger. Nora picked fries and a Coke, her choice hesitant but firm. As they ate, she pulled the sketchbook out again, sketching absently. A windmill from the lot, its blades jagged against the sky. Cal watched over his mug, the pencil scratch a soft counterpoint to the diner's noise. "You're getting the hang of it," he said, nodding at the page. She shrugged, but her shoulders relaxed, a hint of color in her cheeks. "It's something to do," she said, her voice stronger now. "Keeps my head quiet." "Know that feeling," Cal replied, taking a bite of his burger. "Road does that for me, keeps the ghosts at bay." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Nora's nod said she understood. They finished eating in that easy silence, the sketchbook open between them like a bridge of its own. Back in the rig, the sun dipped lower, painting the cab in amber, and Nora kept drawing, adding a river to her windmill, then a figure, small and shadowed, standing beside it. Cal didn't ask who it was, her maybe, or her folks, but he felt the weight of it, a story unfolding in pencil strokes. As dusk settled, the radio crackled back to life. Johnny Cash now, low and steady, and Cal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, frowning at the screen. A voicemail from a sheriff's office, time stamped an hour ago. Cal Wheeler, got a report of a missing girl. Matches your rig's last stop at Dottie's. Call us back. Need to confirm. His stomach dropped, the cab suddenly too small. He glanced at Nora, her head bent over the sketchbook, oblivious, and the pieces clicked. Runaway, foster care, a system hunting her down. He could turn her in, let the law sort it out, keep his hands clean. But those hazel eyes, that bridge sketch, Ellie's book, they held him fast. He deleted the message, his thumb hovering over the button before pressing down, a choice made in the quiet. "You good?" he asked, his voice steady despite the churn in his gut. Nora looked up, nodding, her pencil pausing. "Yeah," she said, a flicker of trust in her gaze. Cal forced a smile, turning back to the road as darkness swallowed the plains. Cheyenne loomed ahead, but so did questions. How long could he keep her safe? How far would this ride go? The rig rolled on, carrying them deeper into the night. Two lost souls tethered by sketches and silences. A road stretching towards something neither could name yet. The Wyoming dusk painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the plains giving way to rugged hills as Cal Wheeler's rig rumbled closer to Cheyenne. The cab was a cocoon of quiet, the engine's drone blending with the faint crackle of country radio. Willie Nelson's voice weaving through the static, soft and mournful. Cal gripped the wheel, his gray eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, where Nora sat hunched in the passenger seat, her sketchbook open on her lap. Her pencil scratched a new drawing, a jagged horizon, a lone truck cutting through it, her focus a shield against the world outside. The voicemail from the sheriff still echoed in Cal's mind, deleted but not forgotten. "Missing girl, matches your rig's last stop." His choice to keep her secret weighed heavy, a stone in his gut, but he couldn't unmake it. Not now, not with her beside him. They'd been on the road 2 days, a rhythm settling between them. Diner stops, gas pumps, stretches of silence broken by Nora's sketches and Cal's gruff stories of Ellie. The trust bridge she'd drawn back at Dottie's tied them together, a shared anchor of loss, but this, hiding her from the law, was new territory. He glanced at her, her hoodie hood shadowing her face, her small frame dwarfed by the seat. She trusted him, or was starting to, and that trust felt fragile as glass. He'd lost Ellie to a crash he couldn't stop. He wouldn't lose this kid to a system that didn't care. The sign for Big Rig Haven loomed ahead, a truck stop just shy of Cheyenne, its neon arrow blinking through the twilight. "Fuel and a brake," Cal said, his voice steady despite the churn inside. Nora nodded, closing the sketchbook and tucking it into her backpack. He pulled into the lot, the rig's tires crunching gravel, and parked among a cluster of semis, their chrome glinting under floodlights. The air was cool and dry as they climbed out, the tang of diesel mixing with the faint promise of rain. Cal headed for the pumps, waving Nora toward the diner. "Grab us a spot," he called. "I'll be in soon." She hesitated, then trudged off, her sneakers scuffing the ground. He was halfway through fueling when headlights swept the lot, a sheriff's cruiser, slow and deliberate, rolling past the rigs. Cal's pulse spiked, his hand tightening on the nozzle. He kept his head down, cap pulled low, but his eyes tracked the car as it circled, then parked near the diner entrance. 2 deputies stepped out, their radios crackling, their gazes scanning the crowd spilling from the building. Truckers, waitresses, a few late travelers. Cal finished fueling, his jaw clenched, and locked the rig, Ellie's sketchbook a quiet weight in his jacket. He'd known this might come. Runaways didn't vanish without a trace. But not this soon, not here. Inside the diner, the air buzzed with clatter and chatter, the smell of fried eggs and coffee thick. Nora sat in a corner booth, her back to the wall, her eyes darting to the deputies as they approached the counter. Cal slid in across from her, keeping his movements casual, his voice low. "Stay calm," he muttered, nodding toward the menu. "Order something, act normal." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she grabbed the laminated sheet, but she nodded, a flicker of trust in her hazel eyes holding him steady. The deputy spoke to the cashier, a wiry man with a buzz cut. showing him a photo, their voices muffled but sharp. Cal caught snippets. Missing girl, last seen near Route 30. Truck stop reports. His stomach twisted. They were close, too close. Nora's breath hitched, her menu shaking, and Cal reached across, resting a hand near hers. Not touching, just there. Look at me, he said, soft but firm. We're fine, just two folks eating supper. She met his gaze, her fear raw but fading, and nodded again, slower this time. The deputies moved through the diner, stopping at tables, showing the photo. Cal ordered coffee and a burger, Nora picking fries and a milkshake, her voice a whisper when the waitress came. The lawmen drew nearer, their boots thudding on the tile, and Cal's mind raced. Turn her in, end this now, or ride it out. He'd deleted the message, crossed that line, and Ellie's memory. Her laugh, her sketches, kept him from stepping back. The deputies reached their booth, one holding the photo, a grainy shot of Nora, younger, smiling. Evenin', the taller one said, his badge glinting. Seen this girl? Went missing out of Omaha, might have hitched a ride. Cal's heart thudded, but his face stayed stone. Nope, he said, sipping his coffee, his tone flat. Just me and my niece here, road trip to Cheyenne. Nora froze, her milkshake straw halfway to her mouth, but she didn't flinch, just stared at the table, playing along. The deputy's eyes narrowed, flicking between them, then lingered on Nora. You sure? He pressed. Looks a lot like her. Cal shrugged, meeting his gaze. Lots of kids look alike. She's mine, been with me all week. The lie rolled out easy, a shield he hadn't planned but wouldn't drop. The deputy hesitated, then nodded, tucking the photo away. All right. Call if you see her. Sheriff's number's on the flyer. They moved off, leaving a stack of papers on the counter, and Cal exhaled, his shoulders easing. Nora's eyes met his, wide and searching, a question unspoken. Why'd you do that? She whispered, her voice trembling but steady. Cal set his mug down, the weight of trust settling heavy. 'Cause you're scared of being forgotten, he said. I know that feeling. Lost my girl, Ellie, 5 years back. Been running from it ever since. Ain't letting you disappear, too. Her lips quivered, tears brimming but not falling, and she nodded. A pact sealed in the diner's hum. They ate in silence, the deputies leaving as rain began to patter outside. Later, back at the bridge they'd passed miles ago, Cal pulled over, the truss looming dark against the dusk. He handed Nora the sketchbook. Let's let him go, he said, flipping to Ellie's old bridge drawings. She took it, her hand steady now, and they stepped out, scattering the pages into the wind, Ellie's bridges fluttering free, a release for them both. Nora's sketch stayed, tucked safe, a new bridge binding them tighter. The rig rolled on, the night closing in, Cal's choice a quiet vow. He'd protect her, law or no law, because on this road, trust was heavier than guilt, and they'd carry it together. The Wyoming morning dawned crisp and golden, sunlight spilling over the rolling hills as Cal Wheeler's rig rattled into Cheyenne, its silver bulk glinting against the sprawl of warehouses and truck yards. The cab was quiet, the radio off, the only sound the steady thrum of the engine and Nora's soft breathing beside him. She sat curled in the passenger seat, her sketchbook clutched tight, her hazel eyes tracing the town's edges through the window. 2 days on the road had woven a fragile trust between them, sketches shared, secrets bared, a lie to the deputies sealing it. But the weight of that choice pressed heavy on Cal now. The sheriff's voicemail, deleted but looming, haunted him. Nora was a runaway, hunted. And Cheyenne wasn't the end of the line he'd hoped. He pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts, a gritty hub called Prairie Rest, its lot packed with semis and the air thick with diesel and coffee. Last stop for a bit, Cal said, his voice gruff but gentle, cutting the engine. Stretch your legs, grab some breakfast. Nora nodded, sliding out with her backpack, her sneakers scuffing the gravel as she headed for the diner. Cal watched her go, Ellie's sketchbook a warm weight in his jacket, his mind churning. He'd lied to the law back at Big Rig Haven, called her his niece, bought her time, but time was running out. He couldn't keep her hidden forever, not without a plan, and the thought of losing her to foster care twisted his gut like a rusted knife. Inside, the diner buzzed with morning clamor, truckers swapping stories, waitresses balancing trays, the sizzle of bacon cutting through the noise. Cal found Nora in a booth near the back, her hood up, Her sketchbook opened to a new drawing, the rig, its lines bold against a jagged horizon. He slid in across from her, ordering coffee and eggs, her picking pancakes, her voice a whisper when the waitress came. They ate in silence, Nora's pencil scratching between bites, but Cal's eyes kept drifting to the door, half expecting Badges to walk through. "You're quiet," she said finally, glancing up, her tone tentative but sharp. He forced a smile, sipping his coffee. "Just thinking. Cheyenne's a good spot, gotta figure what's next." Her pencil paused, her hands tightening on it. "Next?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "You mean, after you drop me off?" Cal's chest tightened, her fear mirroring his own. He set the mug down, meeting her gaze. "Ain't dropping you nowhere," he said, firm and low. "Not unless you want it. We're in this together, far as I'm concerned." Her eyes widened, tears brimming but not falling, and she nodded, a small, shaky motion that sealed something unbreakable. The moment shattered as headlights flared outside, 2 sheriff's cruisers pulling into the lot, their red and blues flickering through the diner's windows. Cal's pulse spiked, his hand clenching the mug. "Stay put," he muttered, his voice steel as he watched deputies step out, radios crackling, flyers in hand. They'd tracked her, Dottie's, the truck stops, his rig's plates piecing it together. The diner hushed, eyes turning, and Nora shrank into her seat, her sketchbook snapping shut. Cal stood, slow and deliberate, his bulk a shield as he moved toward the counter, intercepting the deputies before they reached her. "Mornin'," the lead deputy said, a stocky man with a buzz cut, holding up Nora's photo. "Cal Wheeler, got a tip you've been traveling with a girl, matches this one, missing from Omaha, runaway case." His tone was clipped, official, but his eyes narrowed, sizing Cal up. Cal crossed his arms, his face stone. "She's my niece," he said, the lie steady despite the sweat on his palms. "Been with me all week, family trip? You got the wrong kid." The deputy frowned, glancing past him to Nora, who sat rigid, head down. "Mind if we talk to her?" he pressed. "Just to confirm." Cal's jaw clenched, but he nodded, stepping aside, his heart thudding as the deputies approached the booth. Nora looked up, her face pale, her hands trembling under the table. "Hey, kid," the second deputy said, softer, kneeling to her level. "You okay? We're looking for a girl who ran off. Need to make sure you're safe." Her eyes flicked to Cal, a silent plea, and she swallowed hard. "I'm fine," she rasped, her voice shaking but clear. "He's my uncle. Been with him since Omaha. I ain't missin'." The deputy studied her, then the photo, doubt creasing his brow. Before he could push, the diner door swung open and Dottie strode in, red hair wild, apron still tied from her shift hours away. "Cal Wheeler," she called, marching over, her voice cutting through the tension. "Heard you were in a bind. Sheriff called me about this girl." She planted herself beside Cal, hands on hips. "She's been with him, all right. I saw him at my place. Good man, Cal. Wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a kid." The deputies blinked, caught off guard, and a murmur rippled through the diner, truckers nodding, a waitress chiming in. "He's a regular. Decent guy." Cal seized the moment, his voice low but fierce. "She's not going back to foster care," he said, stepping forward. "Lost her folks. Fire took 'em. I've lost 2. My girl, Ellie, 5 years back. Ain't letting her disappear into some system that don't give a damn. I'll foster her myself. Legal, proper. Check my record, call who you gotta call. I'm keeping her." The lead deputy's eyes narrowed, but Nora stood, her small frame trembling, her voice breaking through. "He's the first one who's cared," she said, tears spilling now. "I feel safe with him. Please." The diner fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy. The deputies exchanged a look, then the softer one nodded. "We'll need to verify. Run it up the chain," he said, tucking the photo away. "But if you're stepping up, Wheeler, we'll see what the judge says. Stay put till we sort it." They left, the cruisers rolling out, and Cal exhaled, his knees weak as he sank back into the booth. Nora slid beside him, not close, but near, her sketchbook open to the bridge again, a silent thank you. The fight wasn't over. Paperwork, courts, a battle ahead, but the diner rallied, truckers slapping Cal's shoulder, Dottie pouring free coffee. Nora's hand brushed his sleeve, a fleeting touch, and he met her eyes, trust, raw and real, staring back. They'd built a bridge, not just of steel and sketches, but of family, and Cal would fight to keep it standing, no matter what came next. The Wyoming summer sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the plains as Cal Wheeler's trailer sat parked on a quiet lot outside Cheyenne. 6 months had passed since the standoff at Prairie Rest, since Cal had fought to keep Nora, and the air now carried the scent of sagebrush and warm earth, a far cry from the storm-soaked night they'd met. The trailer was small, a weathered single-wide with a sagging porch, but it was home. Inside, Nora's sketches lined the walls, bridges, windmills, the rig, her pencil strokes a testament to the life they'd carved together. Cal stood by the stove, flipping pancakes, his denim shirt rolled to the elbows, while Nora sat at the table, her sketchbook open to a new drawing, the old truss bridge, its rusted frame gleaming under a bright sky. The fight for her hadn't ended in the diner. There had been court dates, social workers, stacks of paperwork Cal barely understood. But he'd pushed through, his gruff resolve matched by Nora's quiet courage. Dottie had testified, truckers had vouched, and a judge, moved by their story, had granted Cal temporary guardianship, with adoption papers pending. Nora wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was his, a makeshift family born from loss and rebuilt on trust. She'd started school in Cheyenne, her voice stronger now, her hazel eyes brighter, though the shadows of her past lingered. Cal felt it too. Ellie's absence still ached, but Nora's presence softened the edges, a bridge across the gap. "Pancakes are up," Cal called, sliding a plate across the table, his voice rough but warm. Nora glanced up, a faint smile tugging at her lips, rare but real. "Thanks," she said, her rasp smoothed by months of safety, and dug in, syrup dripping onto the sketchbook's edge. Cal sat across from her, coffee in hand, watching her eat with a quiet pride. "Got a call today," he said, sipping the black brew. "Town council's meeting about that bridge, might fix it up. Folks heard your story, want to help." Nora's pencil paused, her eyes widening. "The bridge?" she echoed, a spark flaring in her voice. "Ours?" "Yeah," Cal said, leaning back. "Figured we could pitch in, make it something worth keeping. Call it Ellie's Span, for her and you." He pulled Ellie's sketchbook from his jacket, now a shared treasure, its pages a mix of her bridges and Nora's. She nodded, fierce and fast, her fingers tracing the drawing. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady. "For them too, Mom and Dad." Cal's chest warmed, the weight of their losses lighter when shared, and he ruffled her hair, a rare touch she didn't flinch from anymore. Weeks later, they stood by the old truss bridge back in Nebraska, its rusted beams groaning under the summer breeze. The community had rallied, truckers from Dottie's and Prairie Rest, locals with tools and paint, even the sheriff's deputies who'd once hunted Nora, now hauling lumber with sheepish grins. Cal led the effort, his hands steady on a wrench, while Nora directed with her sketches, her small frame buzzing with purpose. The bridge wasn't just steel and wood. It was memory, a monument to Ellie's love of spans and Nora's tether to her parents' picnics. They stripped rust, bolted new supports, painted it a deep green, Ellie's favorite color, until it stood proud against the plains, no longer crumbling, but strong. The unveiling came on a Saturday, the sun high and the air alive with laughter and barbecue smoke. A crowd gathered, Dottie flipping burgers, truckers cracking beers, kids running under the bridge's shadow. Cal and Nora stood at its center, a plaque nailed to the railing. Ellie's Span, in memory of those we carry. Cal's throat tightened as he read it, Ellie's sketchbook in his pocket, her bridges now alive in steel. Nora clutched her own drawing, the one she'd made at Dottie's, and stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "This is for Ellie," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hush. "And my folks. Cal gave me a home, helped me keep them too. Thanks for fixing this with us." Cheers erupted, hands clapping Cal's shoulders, but he barely heard. His eyes were on Nora, her words a balm to the guilt he'd carried since Ellie's crash. He knelt beside her, his voice low. "Your family, kid," he said. "Ain't letting you go. Ellie'd be proud." Nora's eyes glistened and she hugged him, quick, fierce, the first time she'd reached out. He hugged back, awkward but sure, the bridge beneath them steady as their bond. Months later, back in Cheyenne, life settled into a rhythm. School for Nora, short hauls for Cal, the trailer a haven of sketches and pancake mornings, the bridge stood miles away, a symbol of what they'd built, its green paint catching the sun in photos locals sent. Cal kept one on the fridge, Nora's drawing beside it, a reminder that loss left gaps, but love built bridges. Sometimes all it took was stopping to see who was on the other side. He'd lost Ellie, Nora, her parents, but they'd found each other, a family forged in diner booths and highway miles, stronger than steel. One evening, as dusk fell, Cal sat on the trailer steps, coffee in hand, Nora sketching beside him, the rig this time, its wheels kicking up dust. "You ever miss the road?" she asked, her pencil pausing. He smiled, faint but real. "Got you now?" he said. "That's enough." She nodded, sketching again, and the quiet wrapped them like a blanket. The fight was over, the bridge rebuilt, their hearts too, and in its shadow, they'd found home. Their story whispers a truth. Life can shatter us, but it's in the cracks that we find connection. No matter how dark the road, there's always someone waiting to cross it with you. Sometimes all it takes is stopping to see them. Cal and Nora remind us to hold tight to hope, to build bridges where others see ruins, and to fight for the family we choose. So, take this with you. Healing starts with a single step, and every journey's better shared. If Cal and Nora's tale moved you, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories of heart and hope coming your way. Leave a like, drop a comment with your thoughts, or where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video where another bridge waits to be crossed.